This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for How to Super Age with Elise Marie Collins. And I'm going to tell you, Elise, I've been in a fog for the last couple weeks, so I really need this podcast today because you always add a spark and you always tell us something that's in that wonderful book.
Thank you so much, Karen. Yeah, I'll start with a quick intro before we get to our guest, who's going to be amazing. This is my book. The podcast is How to Super Age. My book is Super Ager, which has tips and tricks and stories on how to live a long and healthy life. And today we're going to learn a lot about how to change our habits in a really sustainable and applicable way for aging and really for any stage of life, because we're always going to be aging. But I wrote this book to inspire people to have purpose, to want to live a long life, because let's face it, there's always going to be setbacks, there's going to be frustrations, and we're going to learn a lot today from our guest, again, about how to, I'd say, keep on keeping on. You can find my book. I'm going to leave a link in the show notes, and also a link. I'll leave my link tree, and you can also get a free tip sheet on how to super age, a super ager tip sheet with some inspirational super agers. So let's get to our guest. Her name is Ellen. I hope I'm saying this name right. So you're going to have to correct me for your last name if I get it incorrect. Ellen Khalifa has created an encore in behavior change for health span and longevity. She is a certified tiny habits coach and has practiced the tiny habits method for nearly 10 years. Ellen has spent decades as a content writer in healthcare, creating physician, patient, and health education materials. Ellen is also trained as a matter of balance coach to prevent life-changing injuries for older adults, and as a peer educator for the American Bone Health. And you can find Ellen online at her website, Wyzage, and it's spelled with the Wise is spelled with a Y. So we'll leave that link also in the chat. So is there anything else you want to add for your bio, or anything else you did that's not included in what I mentioned, Ellen?
That's a great place to start. I guess if there's anything else I'll add, I will do it as we talk.
Sounds great. So I am so curious about your journey, because I know you're a content creator, and we'll get to that in health and wellness and behavior. Just tell us what a lot of our listeners, I'm sure, and maybe even Karen, does not know what the tiny habits method is. Could you just tell us, just give us a brief overview and what drew you to the tiny habits?
Sure. So yes, I guess in just a few months, it will be 10 years since I first learned about BJ Fogg, who is a researcher at Stanford University, and he created tiny habits. I was drawn to it because I think, like so many people, I've tried to make, I had up to that point tried to make positive change in my life. And, when we don't succeed at these kinds of changes, we tend to blame ourselves, but it's not our fault. It's really our approach to change. And that was just a revelation to me. Our approach to change is too big, it's too vague, or it's too complex, meaning there are too many steps involved. We don't know how to break it down. And the other thing we don't understand is how our brains make habits. Our brains are these complex mechanisms, and our brains are always trying to offload burden because, our environments are just an onslaught of sensory information. So think about the first time you had to back up a car, for instance. I mean, the very first time you had to do that, it probably took most of your brain's processing power. But our brains make habits because that offloads some of that burden. And so you do things over and over, it becomes a habit, it becomes automatic, and you don't have to think about it. The idea with tiny habits is that you start very small and you're looking for success because our brains want a reward. And this doesn't mean like a piece of chocolate cake. I mean, that can be a reward, but just feeling good. There's a chemical our brains release called dopamine. It's called the reward chemical. And when you do something well, when you feel good about something, your brain rewards you. So succeeding at an activity or an action, that's a behavior. As you automate the behaviors, they become habits. And BJ Fogg created this. He started out with things like flossing one tooth because he couldn't get to all his teeth, and he would feel bad about that. And so you just start very tiny and you look for success because we change best by feeling good. Any questions? Answers?
Yeah, I would like to hear that. That was a great explanation. I'm familiar, but I even gained a lot in that explanation. I'm wondering how specifically it can help older adults or help us as we age.
Absolutely.
Any habits.
Our lifespans have doubled in the past 100 years, but I think our brains are our mentality around aging, as you well know, is still back in the 20th century. So you live long enough, change comes to you. As we go through life, we get medical diagnoses, we lose friends or families, we might get laid off, perhaps due to ageism, or simply quit our jobs. We can feel increasingly a loss of control over life around us, over our bodies, and we also internalize those ageist messages around us. So staying adaptable, finding resilience, and finding the simplest ways to keep positivity in our lives give us a feeling of more control, and they can keep us happier and healthier. I can go into more, but I can stop there if you have any other questions.
Yeah, I love that. I hadn't even thought of it that way, the sense of control, because that is something I didn't anticipate that answer. Because I'm always thinking of get healthier. I'm a yoga teacher and always helping people. I help clients, just kind of hone in on their own health as a coach. But I hadn't even thought of that because as we get older, we do lose that locus of control in some ways. It's just shifting. It's a moving target. So I love that. Do you have any examples of how you've used tiny habits or you've used them with someone that's getting older to help them feel like it's like also just not control, but like empowered? I get the feeling like I feel empowered when I have control over my habits. So any comments along that question or anything I said?
Absolutely. So one of the things I wanted to say is, I don't know if you've heard this acronym called VUCA, VUCA. It was started by the military in the 20th century after World War II for troops and commanders to get a sense when they were in situations where things were so volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Those are the four letters, VUCA. That they couldn't read the sign. They didn't know how to react in environments because they couldn't read what was going on. And then maybe 5-6 years ago, it was very popular in the business world as a concept with companies adapting to a global marketplace. But I think with COVID, I don't think there's anybody on the planet who is not living in this situation, the sense of VUCA. And it's magnified, I think, as you get older, number one, you have more perspective and insights. So you wonder more about where things are going. And perhaps you've had lifelong habits that have always worked and suddenly they're not working anymore. That's one way. But I know for myself, I'll tell you some of the things that have happened to me. I was diagnosed with osteoporosis. And one of my favorite quotes actually comes from a 20th century Polish poet. And it says, "Youth is the gift of nature, but age is a work of art." And so I think that idea that, our bodies and brains have just gone along and they've done whatever we wanted for a long time. And in midlife, that starts to shift. So we suddenly have to start adjusting to changes that come to us. And I know for myself, I suddenly had to start looking at my exercise routine, the stuff I was always doing, even for doing yoga. I'm not supposed to ever do a shoulder stand again. I'm never supposed to do the plow pose because I put my bones at risk. I could sustain a fracture that I wouldn't even necessarily feel. I had to eat differently. I have to watch how much alcohol I drink, how much caffeine I drink. So all of these things started happening, and you can start feeling just, I mean, this isn't even a very serious diagnosis. This is something that adapting my behaviors will let me adjust to. But people get very serious diagnoses and they're like, why me? Why has this happened to me? So any tiny bit of a way to feel proactive, to feel that we're taking charge and empowering ourselves is absolutely part of that. My mother got a PhD in gerontology in the 70s, and she's now walked the talk into a vibrant 89 years old, but she talks about that kind of increased anxiety, loss of control. So there are those things, and I try to work with her. I work even with my daughter on it. But yes, when I spent a lot of time on Clubhouse doing rooms for tiny habits, and people will get on stage and they'll talk about, I'm living with chronic pain, or I've lost my job, or all of these different situations. And we try to troubleshoot the actions they might want to be taking. And again, people feel overwhelmed. Things just seem so big and so complicated, that VUCA world I was mentioning. And if you bring it down very small, what has the most meaning to you? How can you make these little changes? Because if you make things small and if you make them successful, you're going for success. You're not going for big. You're not going for all of this stuff. BJ Fogg says, we're living in a world where we're surrounded by go big or go home messaging. You're either a superstar or you're a loser. Well, most of us are guaranteed to fail. It's these crazy stories that the media is just full of an 80-year-old guy running his 40th marathon. So most of us, we only feel like losers. But again, be the superstar in your own life. Take things down till they're so small that you succeed, and then you celebrate it. There's actually a recipe for tiny habits, which I can go into. But, here's something that I do after I eat dinner. I used to love something cold and refreshing. And so, yeah, ice cream. I've discovered that keeping a little box of frozen berries in the freezer. So after I start having cravings for maybe, wanting to eat ice cream, I'll just take out a handful of frozen berries. And that satisfies my craving. And then, I'm not eating a big bowl of ice cream at night.
So I have a funny story about, I heard you say one of those quotes on Clubhouse, and I think I might have told you this, but I'll tell the audience because I thought it was hilarious. Back in the fall, I taught my first in-person yoga class in over, I think 18 months. And I don't know even what I was mentioning, but I said, I probably was just I always encourage people in my yoga classes to work gently, it's not about pushing yourself. That's how I teach. That's my yoga. And I said, go big or go home. That often ends in, you go home, you go big or go home. And two women in the class, one of them I knew, started giggling, like literally laughing out loud. And I was like, oh, what happened? And then at the end, they told me they both worked at a startup, and that was the motto, go big or go home. And it had gone out of business. So there's that, that's a great metaphor. Could you repeat, because I got like the VUCA, I've heard that before, but I feel like I need to hear it again. And I'm imagining someone, I often listen to podcasts when I'm driving. I'm imagining someone listening to it. And I'm like, oh, what was that VUCA word again? I mean, we can look it up, but it's, say what that is. And I love the Polish quote. If you could just repeat those, because I need to hear those again.
Okay, of course. So VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And the quote is, youth is the gift of nature, but age is a work of art.
I love that. I love that.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really, and I mean, I think, again, we're surrounded by all of these ageist messages, it's downhill after 30. I think the industrial age really created this attitude that the past has nothing to inform the future. The industrial age is over, but we're still living with this, if you're not the fastest person on the assembly line putting widgets into some gizmo, that your value declines. And so I think we're wiser, we're smarter in old age because we're not as quick, but we have much more perspective. And that's why I decided to call myself Wyzage. There's a line in Psalm number 90, which is said to have been created by Moses, wandering in the desert looking for the promised land. But it says, teach us to count our days rightly, that we may obtain a wise heart. And this idea of what does it mean to count our days rightly? I think it means to be present, to show up in our lives, to be resilient when we're confronted by difficult situations. I mean, 20-somethings are just so depressed during COVID with the lockdown. Whereas I think they're showing that older people, we've been through this, we've survived to this moment. So we just know how to adapt. But I think part of the other messaging we're receiving, again, it has to do with ageist messaging, is that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. That's a fixed mindset. We need to have this growth mindset that we're never too old to start making small positive changes. We're never too old to adapt. It's good for our bodies and it's good for our brains to stay adaptable. And for human evolution, as humans, we were never designed to just quit at a certain age, to sit in a recliner and watch TV all day. And that lifestyle has serious consequences. And it's not just here in the US. I have a friend from Seoul, South Korea, who told me that's what her 80-year-old mother does. And it makes for emotional misery, and I think it makes for physical suffering. Elise, you're a gerontologist. You can probably answer questions that I have in terms of this kind of, as our bodies stiffen, are we really, in terms of neuroscience, are our brains really stiffening, or we're just buying into this idea that it's time to lie back and not do anything?
Ellen, I'm glad you brought up osteoporosis because many of us have it. We have it at different degrees. But I remember when my grandmother was diagnosed, basically, she sort of gave up doing a lot of things. She would say she couldn't cook anymore because she couldn't stand on her feet. But things that back in the 50s and 60s, maybe that's what doctors said. I was diagnosed 2 years ago, based on the fact that in a 3-year period, I broke 3 bones. But I've learned to adapt. I'm not stopping. And I think that's what is going to change the look of ageism, is when we can say, maybe I did this when I was 20, but look what I'm doing at 50 and look what I'm doing at 80, because there's plenty to do, but we have to take care of ourselves. And that starts when we're younger and moving forward. So the fact that you have a diagnosis doesn't mean that you have to be put out to pasture.
No, it's absolutely true. There's a guy named Jim Quick who has this organization called Quick Brain. It's he, at the age of 5, he suffered a traumatic brain injury, and a teacher even told the class, "Don't blame him. He's the boy with the broken brain." And he's gone on to become this guru of learning and recall and brain health. And what he says is, if you never make efforts, life always seems hard. But the more efforts you make, the less hard life becomes. So you're absolutely right. And I think there was this sort of idea of like, oh, your bones are made of glass, watch out, you might trip and fall. The truth is, the more you do, the more muscles you build. I mean, there's Lawrence Fishman who started yoga for osteoporosis. And I started using those low yoga poses. I mean, there are certain things I can't do, but I'm doing everything. And that's what motivated me to become a peer educator for American Bone Health, because my doctor, who's this very capable woman in her 40s, was like, "Oh, you seem young and healthy. I think you're fine. But if you're nervous, I'll write you a prescription for these very, I mean, I think prescription should be the like sort of the last resort if not none of your efforts are working." And for some people, that is the reality. But there's so much we can do, and they're finding out. I think there was just a study out of Australia that said with osteoporosis, you actually want to push yourself more doing safe kinds of exercises because it will start to reverse. And that's behind Lauren Fishman's yoga as well. So that I think this idea that you're so fragile, but again, these are the attitudes around aging, you get off the assembly line and you go sit in a rocking chair and play bingo until it's all over. And, we know that's not the healthy way to grow older and to stay healthy.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah, I would love to come back to that great point you made about the industrial age versus, how we're adapting now. Because I think for me, what I've leaned into and what I've learned and what has been valid to me, it just felt very clear, is the yoga lifestyle, more of an Eastern philosophy, which, there was never the Industrial Revolution is a great way of thinking of it, because sometimes I'll call it the dominant culture, the machine, whatever you want to call it. But in the Eastern tradition, such as yoga, I'm also thinking of Qigong. I study with a Qigong teacher, and he always talks about, he literally went up to a mountain in China and did Qigong for, I don't know how many years, but there was masters of all different ages, and they would just do all these beautiful, gentle exercises. And he always has so many great quotes, it's just like, if it's hard now, think how hard it will be in 10 years. And most of his stuff is really gentle. So even if it's hard, like if you don't do it, it's going to get harder. And just that you're moving your life force, your vitality through your body, that informs me and how I think of things, rather than that, it's literally like a machine. So many people think, oh, my car, I have a lot of mileage. We hear that, right? So if you have anything on that, and I'd love to hear how I know you're a content creator and you were doing content in, I'm imagining, I don't know where you worked, but you were talking to Westerners, I believe, unless there's something I missed. But when you're a content creator for physicians and other, maybe a healthcare website, I'm not really sure, but how, what did you learn from that? Because you're also talking to people steeped in the culture, and maybe, I'd just love to hear more about that job.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I just wanted to comment though on the first thing you were talking about with yoga and Qigong, because it's so fascinating to me that neuroscience is now proving what ancient wisdom and our kind of own intuition has always told us. So the science is now, it's really there. But yes, so I worked for decades for hospital marketing and education departments. I worked for a medical association. I worked with I guess there was a psychologist with an online institute to train other psychologists. And it was amazing for me to see that as soon as somebody puts on their subject matter hat, even if they're educating their peers, it becomes, they want to show off all their knowledge. It's not about communicating. It's not about the outcome and the behaviors you want from your audience. In software design and in other kinds of product design, they talk about user experience or UX. You might have heard the term, but it was very interesting becoming a really early advocate. I started doing this around the time that expression user experience was created in product design. But I was struggling. I was trying to write brochures. One of the jobs I had was, it was a perinatal, which is high risk neonatal regional hospital for very premature babies and new babies with serious illnesses. And I saw literally rocket scientists reduced to the reading level of a second grader because they were so anxious about what had happened with their baby. And given their emotional states, they were not capable of reading rules and regulations and a lot of medical information. It was very disempowering. It was using third person, the procedure will be performed on the patient by the doctor, very third person instead of, this is what you can expect. This is how you participate in your care. So I had battles for a lot of years, using plain language which is a whole movement in content writing. Clear language is especially big now in medicine and in the legal profession, because again, it's kind of a big secret to keep, us from, can't imagine why they wouldn't want us to participate in our own positive outcomes in our health, but that's how it started out. These godly figures would throw lots of jargon at you, and then you were supposed to figure out what to do with it. And of course, it's not leading to good outcomes in healthcare. So there was a lot of that. But again, it was sort of, what are the actions, what are the behaviors we're supposed to take away from this information that I'm creating, so that we can do the behaviors we need to resolve situations that we are in. And I guess that was part of what inspired me to get involved in Tiny Habits. I was still working in that work at the time, and it got more and more frustrating eventually, because it's a slow process. Now I think you'll see beautiful, there's been an evolution actually. You'll see beautiful health materials that are for very low literacy audiences, great graphics, a picture's worth 1,000 words, videos and animations can teach people so much more than, pages of brochures in print. So there's a lot that's gone on since then. But again, it was all about our actions and our behaviors and our participation and our empowerment in our own lives. So that's how I've evolved to where I am.
Wow, that's interesting. I know that, yeah, and another thing that you mentioned, and I see this a lot, where, there's a lot of explanations and, these habits, we know how much our habits affect our health more than our genes, more than anything, but we're not getting a lot of information from our doctors, from nurses, from healthcare practitioners on how to actually change habits. Do you have anything to say about that?
Oh, yes, I certainly do. And that was one of the reasons I got trained as a matter of balance coach. I was actually approached by somebody from the county that you and I live in, Elise, and it was to be a volunteer, but I thought, oh, this will brush up. I had just gotten certified in Tiny Habits. I thought, what a great way to get some coaching skills together, because my ambition isn't really to coach individuals. It's really to try and get this word out within healthcare. So it's a program that I think it's still being marketed kind of more as exercise, and it's really not. It's a program about mindset for people who are at risk of falling and have concerns of falling. These are older adults in their 80s and 90s. I think when the program started out 25 years ago, that was probably even aimed at people in their 60s and 70s. But as we kind of evolve, I think we're not as frail as early in life. And so there's been some frustration with people doing the program that it should be more robust, because it's too, the exercises aren't, robust enough. And the idea is that, again, it's kind of starting tiny, but it's a mindset of, I'm the one that runs my life. It's up to me to be mindful in my own home, to not have hazards where I could trip and fall and have a life-changing injury. Pets are one of the biggest causes of accidents for older adults. They have a pet at home and they trip and fall. The dog jumps on them or the cat gets between their feet, they fall. And so there are just so many things we need to know about just showing up in our own lives and taking charge of our own environments. We don't put lights on where we need to. We don't have a night light. We can trip and fall. You don't have to be very elderly. It's I have a neighbor who's 32 and her lifelong childhood friend tripped walking her dog and had to have a hospital bed put in her living room because she couldn't walk upstairs to her bedroom with a broken femur bone. So you don't have to be elderly to have this happen to you. No. But again, the more mindful you are. So I don't know if you've heard of Ellen Langer. She's 75 years old now, but she's been a professor and researcher at Harvard since the 1970s. She's famous for a study called Counterclockwise, where men in their 70s and 80s were brought to a retreat that was completely staged like the 1950s and told to act like they were back in their lives in the 1950s, and they had been given health exams both before and after, and they were rated as younger when they walked out of there after 8 weeks. So it just shows you resilience. She's sometimes called the mother of mindfulness in the United States, which is kind of ridiculous. I mean, mindfulness has existed for thousands of years in Eastern traditions, but she's not talking about it in terms of like meditation or yoga. She's talking about it moment to moment. Notice your surroundings. How do you talk to yourself? How do you retrain your brain? And that's the essence of resilience, really. That's where it comes from. Again, it's this idea of growth mindset versus fixed mindset, a flexibility, a joy in learning new things. Neuroscience is showing that novelty is good for our brains. So again, get away from that. Can't teach an old dog new tricks. But it's expected of us as we age. And so that's, I think, part of our good fight here is to get away from that. There's also someone named Chip Conley. I don't know if you've heard of him. He started the Modern Elder Academy, right?
Yes.
The world's first midlife wisdom school. And he says midlife is the time for less either or thinking and more thinking about both and. That is that growth mindset. And that's that wisdom. So I'm all for that.
Yeah, I think Chip Conley's been on New Cleveland Radio,
Yes,
not on
yes,
this show,
yes.
but another show. And he's in my book, as well as Ellen Langer. I'm a huge fan of them both.
Yeah.
Yes, I love it. And so I know that you talk a lot about some of these practices. One of them that I know from knowing you, that you it helps a lot, but people may not be familiar with it. It is in my book as well, but forest bathing. Tell us, like, what got you into forest bathing and what do you love so much about it?
Well, I was always doing it. I just didn't have a name for it. The Japanese have so many amazing practices and ideas about growing older. Forest bathing and ikigai. I can't pronounce forest bathing well. I don't speak Japanese. But it's the idea that natural environments are rejuvenating for us. They're so restorative. And there have been studies in China and Japan that show even frail elderly adults spending time in natural environments surrounded by nature, by trees, that lowers their blood pressure. It reduces their risk of stroke. It reduces depression. And again, here neuroscience is proving this ancient wisdom. There is natural environments are just less complicated. They offer a higher degree of predictability for our nervous systems, so our brains can relax. And at the same time, novelty that appears in those backgrounds intrigues the brain, so it's less stressful. And I learned about this research from the book Blue Mind, which I guess we'll talk about after that. But even heart conditions are reduced by just spending time around nature. It's only maybe in the last 150 years that human beings have poured into cities and started living in mostly urban environments. And they change very quickly. They're stressful environments because things change so rapidly. And the natural forms, the way our brains read them. I mean, they're showing that even like low-income housing projects where people can view trees out the window, there are less incidents of domestic violence. There are fewer incidents of child abuse, just all kinds of different things that happen when our nervous systems can view nature. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I think a couple months ago, maybe it was in the fall, there was a study. I don't know if you heard of this, but I believe it was in the Pacific Northwest in Washington, a story about walking and how I think it was like walking in tree-lined streets had some physiological benefits. I don't even think it was even all the way in the forest, but that was really fascinating to me. And I even just like the name forest bathing because it makes me think, I walk every day, but sometimes I there is places that I go around. Ellen and I live in the same, we live really close to each other. We live in Alameda County. So there's some really nice, actually, we've got some incredible parks here. There, and my mom is from Alameda County, from Oakland. And so she's always like, we have the best, city or urban parks of anywhere in the United States, or I don't know if that's true, but probably we do have some incredible, for being a very urban environment, the Oakland Hills. So I like the idea of forest bathing, because somehow my mind just kind of gravitates to, oh, it's kind of a label. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but it makes me, it kind of helps me to think in terms of, I need to get out in nature more, which I love. And I also want to mention that Ayurveda, I study that, and that arose from some of the first cities in India where people were getting out of touch with nature. And I think that's so fascinating, that whole system. It's not even medicine, because we think of it as an Indian medicine system, but it's really called the science of life. And at the most basic level, I think it's about getting back in touch with nature. I would love to hear about Blue Mind, because it's another one of those terms that I didn't write about it in my book, but there's so many things. I can't remember what it even means. Tell us about Blue Mind. And some of us maybe don't know what Blue Mind is, a book, or what is it?
So it is a book. There's a marine biologist named Wallace J. Nichols. He's also here in Northern California on what they call the slow coast, sort of above Santa Cruz. So he, being a marine biologist, he has spent his life in around water, and he calls Blue Mind the mildly meditative state we fall into when we're near, in, or around water. And he says, you don't have to meditate near water. The water meditates you. So he talks about how water covers 70% of the earth. When newborn babies are born, their bodies are about 78% water. And then as we grow, even in children, it drops to about 60%, but our brains continue to be about 80% water. And this book is amazing. And the first part of it is neuroscience. Then the last part of it is more about the environment and how critical it is to protect the water resources we have. But when you read this, they've done experiments with cancer patients, and there was a 20 to 30% reduction in the need for pain medication. There were reductions in the need for epinephrine and there were reductions in their stress hormones and cortisol and epinephrine, while simply watching videos of water and hearing water sounds. Dental offices have aquariums. You might wonder why that is. That's part of it as well. We tend to relax around water, the sound of water, even if you can't get to a body of water, taking a bath. And there's actually even, he talks about how, because water is denser than air, just the pressure of water against our skin helps our body release, I guess they're catecholamines, which are chemicals that naturally relax us. So even sitting in a bathtub or soaking your feet can bring this on. Just the sound of water from a water feature in your home, sort of like going back to forest bathing, just having plants in your home makes a huge difference. And I believe that's part of feng shui as well, let alone the fact that plants breathe out oxygen, which we need, and we breathe out carbon dioxide that they need. But again, the same with water, just having that sound in your home. The book has in it, there's a neuroscientist who's called the father of neuroplasticity. His name is Michael, I think I'm pronouncing it right, Mezernik. And he was the one that talked about those, the fact that natural environments change less quickly. Mm. So again, watching, my whole life I could feel when I would look at light reflecting on water, I could feel like you could feel your brain waves changing somehow. I grew up actually near the Great Lakes in Wisconsin. And so I was always around water and on Lake Michigan. And I could just feel when I looked at light on water, it just felt different to me. It's fascinating to know that this is how our brains are. And, to hack the sort of urban environments we live in and the stress, that the cranking up those cortisol and stress hormones. The other thing that Wallace J. Nichols talks about is red mind, which is the stress state we tend to live in, and how Blue Mind is an antidote to this. Blue Mind also quotes Rick Hansen. He's the hardwiring happiness guy. He's at the Greater Good Science Center, I think it's called, also here in the East Bay. He talks about how our brains are wired. This is also, I think, really important for aging. Our brains, for survival, our brains evolved to quickly learn from our bad experiences, but slowly from the good ones. So we're wired to be kind of negative. Our brains are wired to be Teflon for positive experiences and Velcro for negative experiences, which I find fascinating. So we have to hack these systems with practices that rejuvenate us, that relax us. And I feel like that's really a key to longevity. So again, Blue Mind is just any chance I get to look out the window, to hear the sounds of water, to go be near water wherever you can. I think it's totally a longevity practice. So I follow Wallace J. Nichols, and I'm posting things about that. And I always put the longevity and the Blue Mind together.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. That was amazing. Yeah. And I also love Michael, I can never say his name right, Michael Merzenich, maybe. Yeah, I read he has a book, and I follow him too. He's incredible. I wonder, this has just been great. And I wonder if Karen has any final questions.
Well, what I love about what Ellen is talking about is a subject that we talk about so much on New Cleveland, is that it's all about living in the moment and being at your best. And we have to get rid of this negative talk that, if you have an illness, or if you're a certain age, or if you didn't do this when you were younger, you can't do it today, because you possibly can't do it today, maybe not at the same level, but for us to not want to experience life just doesn't make sense. And as you said, we are living longer. And even though many are living with illness, many of them still, even with an illness, can appreciate the life around them. And I'll tell you, nature does it for me all the time. I live, so here in Cleveland, we have what is called the Emerald Necklace, and it's a park system that goes all the way around the city. And we happen to live in a condo right on the edge of it. So trees and grass and deer. If I'm feeling down, all I have to do is look out my window and something brings me back to life. So thank you for all the wisdom you've shared today.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure. It's been great to be here. I also just wanted to mention really quickly. So I mentioned that my mother she got a PhD in gerontology in the 1970s. She joined the faculty of a medical college, but after a number of years, the department was disbanded because medical students didn't want to go into geriatrics. It isn't as well compensated, but also it doesn't have those heroic cures like we're going to fix the problem. And there is this concept, and actually there's a debate going on right now. Is aging a disease or is it not a disease? And so I find that really a fascinating debate. My thinking on it has been evolving as well, because I think we have to separate the biology of aging, which, yes, there are perhaps cures for some of those things, from the psychosocial aging and all of the things we can do for ourselves, all of the living that we can do, and all of the mindset. I mean, even Ellen Langer, she did another study on housekeeping staff in hotels. I don't know if you know this study, but they were divided into two. They were measured. They all had health exams, and they were put into two groups. One just went back to work their regular shifts. The other group were given a few informational sessions on the fact that the work they did was exercise. They're busy all day long, very physically active. They were given specific examples as to how it was exercise. And after only 4 weeks, the informed group, their blood pressure lowered, they lost body fat, they lost inches. I mean, just believing that they were exercising, doing exactly the same tasks as the control group, they got the benefits of exercise. So it tells you how
Wow.
powerful our minds are, and there's so many ways we can be using them. And for me, that's the power of tiny habits. It's just, no matter how overwhelming life may seem, you are, yes, as you said, Elise, empowered to make small changes that give you control over what you need to do. So yeah, it's great. It's been a pleasure being here and talking about all of this with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we can find you at Wyzage. I'll leave that in. Maybe spell it out and tell us if you're on any social media as we close out. Thank you again so much for being a guest.
Sure. Thank you for having me. So it's Wyzage, Wyzage, and I am on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. You can find me there, and I guess on LinkedIn as well, and it's wyzage.com. So thank you, and I'm just so appreciative that you have this podcast, because we are a revolution happening, and we have numbers, and there's every reason that we shouldn't have just long and just long lives at our very best, no matter how old we are.
I love it.
Yay.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. And Elise, we'll
Sure.
see you in a couple weeks again. Take care.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.